How are you? Who's first?
Speaker,
Yes,
I'm
sir.
curious where HB1 is at. Is it going to get vetoed? And if it does, you guys have a plan to pick it up in another fashion?
We're still working together and working well. So
Can you elaborate on that at all?
when I can elaborate, I will elaborate. But we are working well together. So
When you met
I'm
with
happy about that.
with the governor on Monday, did the issue of the casino bill in South Florida come up at all?
No.
Well, when you met with, could you elaborate more about your meeting with the governor in terms of what you all actually discussed and the conversation and what it was about?
Really, just kind of some of the concerns he had with the bill we had already sent to him, the HB1, and that was really it.
And then, as a follow-up, can you explain to me why that meeting shouldn't have been noticed and available and open to the public under the terms of the Constitution?
Because we were notified to come down on the spot. We put it on the calendar. We didn't set it. So.
You put it on. You mean the calendar that's not readily available that you have to ask
No, we put
for?
it on the calendar. We made the governor put it on the calendar.
Well, his calendar came out the next day or that night.
Okay, I don't know about his calendar. It's on my calendar, so. But yeah,
Your
so
calendar.
So
we didn't plan like a week in advance to meet together. So.
But did you plan hours ahead of time? A couple hours?
No.
Like,
I'm busy. He's busy. So whenever we can catch each other and if we have something, we put it on the calendar.
so let me ask you this as then the last follow-up. Then, do you think that you met the spirit of the Constitution?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This is a bill we'd already passed, so we're not talking about legislation anyway. About legislative action, we're talking about his thoughts on a bill that's already been passed. So. Yeah.
You're still talking about potential changes. Wouldn't that require him to veto the bill?
No, we didn't talk about any new bill, but just what his concerns were.
Well, then, I mean, if you're trying to see you're still working together,
Yeah.
presumably that would involve that there's still differences.
We did. That wasn't part of that meeting. When I say we're working together, we're working with staff and trying to figure out where we can land on a product that, it's good. So.
But it's sort of finished now.
Yeah, it's been passed. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's like take it or
But we're
leave it.
looking at we're looking at alternatives and what we can do together. So we're still working together. Yeah.
What are the
Tomorrow the
alternatives that are on
House
the
is,
table?
What's that?
What alternatives are on the table?
I don't have anything further to say about it other than we're going to keep talking, and I really don't have anything to announce yet.
But
When I do,
you could take HB3, which is still
Could,
available in the
yeah.
Senate, and it's still.
we're working together, so we'll see. Everything's going well.
Tomorrow the House is likely going to pass the age restriction, the 21 to 18 for firearms,
Yeah.
and the gender and biological sex bill, both of which are not moving in the Senate and are not likely to.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what is the House's goal and your goal in passing this legislation? What message are you trying to send?
Well, I mean, on the one bill, we passed it last year, and I think many of us feel, and myself included, that what we've seen in the courts is a lot of those similar bills in other states have been declared unconstitutional. That the Second Amendment right, begins at adulthood, which is 18, and that we ought to conform to what I think ultimately will be the decision of the 11th Circuit, though they had a three-judge panel that affirmed our law, and then the court came back behind that and said they wanted to hear it en banc. That was, I don't know how many months ago. It feels like it was a year ago, but time gets a little crazy when you're in session. So but it was months ago at least. They have not obviously ruled on that, and so I believe the court, and maybe they decided not to hear it en banc eventually, but I believe they did. And so I'm expecting a decision from the 11th Circuit, but in any case, there's enough of a conflict between the circuits that at some point we'll see the U.S. Supreme Court, I think, weigh in on that core question. And so on something like that where we say, look, we support a particular position, then, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, but I think this is an important one of constitutional importance that we want to put on the floor. And, sometimes we do that for a member because they're, going to move on, they're going to get termed out. So it's always a decision about whether we want to spend the bandwidth on the floor, our floor time, to pass a bill that we know is not going to pass in the Senate or is already dead in the Senate or doesn't have a companion. But sometimes we do, and we're doing that as well for some of our senior members.
Do you support the ban on offshore wind energy that's part of the omnibus bill? And is that something that, word on the street, that's something that the governor wanted?
Yeah, I don't know who wanted it, but I think it's very similar to offshore drilling. Floridians don't want to sit on the beach and look at oil derricks, and they don't want to sit on the beach and look at big windmills right off the beach. And so I think the way that was crafted was, off the coast or a couple miles in type thing that's reasonable. It doesn't preclude them from doing it elsewhere in the state where it's possible. But I think that's a fair place to land.
On book
Can I ask you on-
challenges, what is the language that is being considered?
challenges, yeah.
Book challenges. I know that the governor
yeah.
has said that he would like to see some changes done. Senate President Pastrana has also expressed interest. What are you interested in seeing regarding some of the guardrails that should be in place for book challenges?
Yeah, I think we're in the same place, which is there's very, very reasonable book challenges for really, really inappropriate books, which are still, I think, somewhere in our office for anybody that actually wants to look at them. And I think most people would agree that they're grossly inappropriate for kids. Not any question, no matter where your politics lie. And then you have a handful of people that are engaging in constant book challenges that are frivolous, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many of us that supported removing those really awful books from the libraries, the school libraries rather. And so what we're trying to do there is set some guardrails, and we're supportive of setting guardrails, and you can do it 10 different ways to say, look, if you're going to keep making challenges, those challenges should be valid, and at some point, you need to either pay for it or be limited in how many challenges you can make if they're frivolous. And some of those have been frivolous.
On a budget matter, the prison system, as you know, there was a much publicized KPMG report that had been done, consultants report on the system and what the system's needs are going forward. Where the budget negotiators seem to be landing is $100 million recurring, but no bonding. This House is reflexively opposed to bonding, is it? And did you hear from the governor on that idea as well? Because he's been campaigning a lot on his ability to draw down the state debt.
Right. I certainly have talked to the governor about drawing down the state debt, and I share his view on that we ought to do that. We did in our House budget. We're looking to do that, and obviously in this final budget, as well as strengthen our reserves. And so on the question of bonding, obviously it runs at cross purposes to reducing debt. There could be circumstances in which a state finds itself in a no-win situation where bonding is absolutely necessary because you don't have the money to cover it. I don't think we're in that situation, and so putting up $100 million that could be continued on into the future would address maintenance needs. And I have spoken with Department of Corrections. They have very significant maintenance needs, and so these monies that we're hoping to push out in this year's budget will start addressing that. It will allow us to lengthen the lifespan of some of our existing prisons, and there was not, in my view, from the conversations I had, an immediate need to bond today. And so there may be in the future that a different legislature may have to wrestle with, but this legislature doesn't see a need to bond. We'd rather pay down debt than grow debt, and that would be about $3 billion.
Doom and gloom in the KPMG report, that it's not really as bad as it appears.
That I don't think
The
it's as
prison
bad as
system.
KPMG.
Yeah, well, as KPMG maybe portrayed it, where they were saying the state needs to go anywhere from $3 billion to $7 billion over the next 20 years.
Well, over the next 20 years, I mean, that may be true. And so do we need to put significant dollars towards our prison? Absolutely. And we're doing that in this year's budget. And as it moves forward and they determine what the prison population looks like and how much lifespan they can get out of existing prisons, then we'll be able to decide whether we can do it out of existing resources. We have a lot of resources right now. So the last thing we should do, with interest rates being at, I would say a historic high, but a historic high for the last couple decades at least, is to go bond now at these higher rates and see where we are. And maybe in a few years, if the legislature decides to do that, maybe those rates are lower and it just makes better sense for the taxpayers. Don't move in that direction unless you really have to.
Mr. Speaker, I have a question about a specific provision in the tax code package regarding the requirement to get the voters to approve the local sales tax option every 10 years. I think there's been concerns made by Jacksonville, and so a couple of questions. Is that going to remain in the tax code package, and was that provision written with Jacksonville in mind?
Yeah, it was. I can definitively say it was absolutely not written with Jacksonville in mind. I think the idea was, don't the taxpayers deserve an opportunity as you have these call them extra taxes or discretionary taxes that maybe the voters approved 20 years ago, that they can actually revisit and say, we passed this tax because of an urgent need. In the case of Jacksonville, there's a pension issue, obviously. But I think pension's a different deal. That's what did not contemplate Jacksonville. But now, 20 years later, 10 years later, we see that there's not a need for those extra taxes other than having extra tax burden on the taxpayers. And so we want the taxpayers to make that decision and not just have it where as soon as you pass a tax, it exists there in perpetuity. But it's a conversation. I'm not afraid of a conversation about, the citizen windstorm idea that Spencer Roach had, which, if we got into a situation where the whole market collapsed, we'd have to have some kind of backup plan. Do I think we should do that this year? Absolutely not. I think the private sector is rebounding, and I would not support doing that at this moment. But it doesn't hurt to have a conversation. We've had others on a variety of topics, some that lasted a while, some that lasted a hot minute, but that's okay. I mean, and it's good to generate those discussions about those topics.
Speaking of citizens, do you think that it's is solvent? Because the governor said it wasn't last night. And then where do you think the House could or should land on, what to do with property insurance in general? I know there's still some bills popping around out there.
I think we need to be careful. We've made major reforms over a short period of time, and you guys know I'm not afraid of major reforms, but having made those reforms, you got to let it settle a little bit. And so I think to your question about other bills out there, I don't think we want to do anything that's going to have a chilling effect on the insurance market at this time. And then with respect to the insolvency comment, I share the governor's concern, because what I think he's saying is if you had, a horrible hurricane season of Category 5 hurricanes ripping through, the number of citizens' policies we have are such that even the reinsurance wouldn't fully cover it. The CAT fund wouldn't fully cover it. And what happens? Then everybody gets assessed. So we are the backstop for that. So ultimately, that insolvency within the system would be paid for by taxpayers in perhaps significant assessments, which is why we've done things over the last couple of years to depopulate citizens, get those policies, and more recently, quite successfully, get private insurers to pick up those citizen policies so that the private market is bearing the risk, not the taxpayers. Because ultimately, citizens is the taxpayers. The taxpayers are going to sit behind them. And so if we have a horrible, horrible hurricane season, the governor's not wrong. He's right that could be a problem. So we got to get that population down where it's manageable, where they're truly the insurer of last resort. And one of the big bright spots about the insurance market since our reforms has been that hundreds of thousands of policies have exited citizens as a result of our reforms, and that's positive. That means there's that much less risk to the taxpayers if a storm comes through.
Can I ask you a macro budget question?
Yeah.
And if you're not totally familiar with it, that's fine. I mean, sometimes the details. Basically, there is an effort going on, and it's subject to negotiations in the silos, but there's also a bigger macro question, and that's about unspent money.
Yeah.
Money, and it seems that, so basically there's an excess of $1 billion of federal money, and the Senate had a detailed plan where they wanted to switch the funding from one thing to another thing in terms of to make sure that the federal money got spent before it has to be clawed back. There's that going on, and then there's also appears to be a great division between the House and Senate on the number of times that the Senate has reappropriated money from last year and said, okay, you're not going to spend it by the time July rolls around. We're going to let you, and you all have not gone anywhere as far on all these reappropriations that they are. I'm just kind of sorry, you had talked earlier about austere budgets and stuff like that. Is there a macro strategy in terms of the House, in terms of like, no, we're not going to authorize all this respending. If something's not done, it's not done, and we want the money back. I mean, I'm just kind of curious if there's been that master conversation.
Well, I would say on the macro level, the relationship between House and Senate and the budget negotiations have been extremely positive and smooth from my perspective. Sure, we have differences on things, then we've worked out many of those differences, and as we go through budget, we'll work out more. But as far as reverting and reappropriating, I guess what I would say is if you had a bunch of money and didn't spend any of the money, we might revert and reappropriate that money, but we wouldn't add money to it, if that's your question. But I haven't seen the deep division you're referring to
I'm not saying,
yet.
I'm just saying it's different approaches, but
Yeah.
look, as a final, do
Yeah.
you think that the state of Florida should do everything it can to make sure that it spends every dollar that it got in the two huge tranches from the federal government, or should any of it be returned if it's not spent?
No, I do believe it should be spent. I will say this, and I've said this before here, is that the way that was set up, it rewarded people who had locked down, who drove their unemployment rate up. So it actually rewarded states who had poor performing economies, and they poorly performed because of poor leadership. We had positive leadership in Florida. Our unemployment rate, we were in better shape as a result of that. We got less, we're bigger than New York. We got a lot less money than New York. I don't think that was fair at all. Now, I've also said we got less than we deserved, but more than we needed in that sense, but we got it. It's everybody's money that got cycled through and reapportioned and redistributed in that fashion. So I would say that money is Floridians' money. I mean, we pay taxes too, and we got less. Let's put it this way: Florida taxpayers paid a greater share to send money to federal money to the people of New York than the people of New York paid to send money to Florida. So we should spend every dollar.
But you went out of your way to pass a balanced budget provision and call on for a convention of states.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of stuff here on the floor talking about the federal government spending a lot of money when it didn't need to.
Yeah, I get that, but here's what will happen, Gary, is if we send it back, it'll be spent on something that is useless and wasteful, and at least we know here between the House and Senate, we're going to spend money on things that actually matter.
On House Bill 1, why didn't you guys take a different approach, which is just banning the addicting features as opposed to, stopping kids from using social media if they have these addicting features? You know what I'm saying? Like, why not just outlaw the use of the addicting features for minors? It seems like that would have gotten around all the constitutional questions.
I think there's a difference between adults and kids. It's an intriguing thought because we really are, to your point, we really are focused not on content at all, but on these addictive features, and we enumerate them, or did enumerate them in HB1. And so if the platforms remove that in the case of children, then we would allow those children to get right back on the platform. And so I think we just took an approach that adults are different. We take a more libertarian approach. You're an adult, do what you want to do, get on whatever platforms you want to get on, but kids are different. And you see in HB3, which of course got onto HB1, where you're not, the courts have said obscenity is not speech. So we're talking about hardcore pornography that we, would apply, we would apply that to, obviously to the kids.
I just mean, like, why not ban the features for minors? Like,
But you'd be banning them for adults and minors, I think, is if I understand your
not necessarily, no, but if you know that
proposal.
the people are kids, which presumably the legislation
Yeah.
says you should know if they're adults or kids, why not just say to social media companies, if you know there's a kid on the platform, you cannot have these features. You cannot serve these features to these kids.
I think we do say that. And if
Well,
you,
if you don't outlaw it, it's still legal for them. I mean, there's penalties.
well, they could have those addictive features for adults. And the question is that healthy for adults? It's not healthy for adults because the whole purpose and the whole business model is beginning with the design is to take the human brain and just kind of what's inherent in how we respond, supercharge that so that all of us want to be on the platforms longer than we otherwise would because of those addictive features. And so that's not, in my mind, a good thing for anybody, and that I think we need to confront that is their business model. They're trying to keep you on, everybody on, as long as possible, and the longer they keep you on, the more money they make. That is the business model. They're monetizing the time your eyeball's on the screen. That is not good for adults, and adults have mental health issues too. But it's not nearly like kids, and we treat kids and adults differently all the time. Smoking, drinking, marriage, driving a car because of their brain development, because of their vulnerability. What we see in the case of public safety issues is you have pedophiles, you have sex predators, you have people that are looking to commit crimes against children that are using these platforms, and the children with their brain development and ability to make those distinctions are not able to stave it off, and they fall victim to that in a way that an adult would not. An adult would be able to, not all of us do, but for the most part, if we're doing something in an addictive way, hopefully at some point we step away and say, this is not good for me, it's not turning out well for me, or if I have harm as a result of that addictive behavior, you can self-regulate and step away from it. Kids have much greater difficulty in doing that. And so I think kids and adults are different. The rules are different. And so that's why we went in the direction we went. I'm not saying that the addictive features are good for adults. I'm not saying that at all.
Yeah, no, I was just,
There-
okay.
There is such a divide in conservative world over this social media bill. I'm wondering, you in your history have been somewhat allied with Koch brothers thinking, Americans for Prosperity.
Yeah.
Did they reach out to you and say, stop, don't do this? And is there a concern that this legislation affects children, but that it is a precedent setter that is going to, you know, become a backlash against right-wing media, maybe?
A backlash against
Well, I
right-wing
mean,
media?
could this somehow interfere with the business models of some larger?
Oh, they're using those addictive
Yeah, they're
features?
using those
Maybe,
addictive
and then
features.
that's
But
okay by me.
that's-
If they're addicting kids, I don't care whether they're right-wing or left-wing or middle of the road. I would say, no, they have not reached out. I would say that where I was a year ago was where a lot of people who say, what's the big deal? You know, are kids on there too much? Yes. Is there a big deal? Like, what's the big deal? And so I would liken it to reading a book that describes the incredible harms that are happening to children, both from a public safety standpoint and a mental health standpoint. And where you are on the bill determines how far along you are in the book. I met with some prosecutors, and I've read a few chapters. Representative Soroy and Senator Grawl have read more chapters than I have for longer than I have. And their feedback and their conversations with me back before this session is what brought me to read the book in the first place. And I've realized the longer I get into that book about the harms of social media to children, how deep and how dark it is. I met with prosecutors the other day who came in my office. They've read the entire book, and they can tell you stories that are absolutely heartbreaking. And when I ask people that are involved in human trafficking with children, I ask them how much of this is social media platforms. They tell me most of it or all of it. It's a major existential threat to this generation and the coming generations, and I can't overstate that enough. This was not an issue that was on my radar at all when I ran for office, until I became speaker, until after really just toward the end of the last session. You know, we had the bill about cell phones in classrooms and that kind of thing, and we're starting to look at that. But it was really only until this year, and even in this session, I've learned more about the public safety aspect of that. I'd heard, was very concerned about, you know, a third of our girls contemplating suicide in the last year. Those are staggering numbers. And if you look at anorexia numbers, and I can provide those to you guys, I'd be happy to, examples of self-harm, people cutting themselves and being hospitalized. You see that through the years, and when Facebook came online and some of these other social media platforms, and I've not really talked about platforms, not just Facebook, but all of the platforms, you see a hockey stick of damage, and it is geometric. And so it's coming from somewhere, and I'm not saying that it's entirely the fault of these addictive platforms, but I think they are a principal cause of the mental health crisis that is facing this generation.
I'm curious, though, too, when you make those compelling arguments to Governor DeSantis, his response is what? I agree with you, but it might be illegal? I mean, Governor DeSantis has not always shied away from something that's going to get the state of Florida into court.
Here's what I would say. I would say that he and I we're almost always on the same page on many issue after issue. And so if there's 3 or 4 values out there that you're looking at, harm to children is one of them, which I think is up to the top of this, you know, rotunda based on the fact that I've spent more time on it. But you also look at things like constitutionality, right? We're both concerned about that. Things like anonymity, we're both concerned about that. And there are other common values that have to be addressed. The age verification process, how much do we need to do for adults to protect kids? Like we go into a liquor store and have to show an ID, or if you look like me or some of the others, I won't name any of the names here, but they're not asking for your ID anymore. And so and we have new technology I want to mention to you, and I think it's worth you pursuing if you're interested in this topic, that is called zero knowledge proof. And so there's this new technology that allows for that kind of thing where you could just get on, and they wouldn't have to know who you were, but they just see the wrinkles, you know, the crow's feet and the gray hair, and I don't want to go too far about my aging demeanor, but or face, but they would be able to know that you're well over 16 without knowing who you are that quickly. And so I think we'll get to a place, and then of course that would be secured with privacy considerations so that you could use that for any number of things that require age. Purchasing a ticket of some kind, buying a bottle of wine or so forth. You could do that without showing your ID. So let's say you're 25 but you look 20 and you don't want anybody to know who you are, you'd just be able to show that QR code with this app. So I think that's where we're headed in terms of technology, but the social media technology has outstripped our brains and our children's brains' ability to withstand some of those pressures and withstand the onslaught that they're receiving from criminals and from just all the mental health harm that's online. And so we think that we can address some of those other concerns. So back to your question is, we all share those same common values, but how you rate them and rank them, I think, determines where you fall on this bill. And if you think that it's, less harmful, then you're more likely to say that those other values should predominate, versus if you think the harm to children predominates, which is where I've come to be, and I wasn't a year ago, then you start to look and say, these other things are important, and we've got to take care of them, and we're trying to, take care of them, but you can't find an excuse not to protect kids. And again, so we've focused on the addictive technologies, which we think is a form of trafficking. You're using addiction on children that causes them harm for money.
On social media, and I know this isn't related to bills, but just as far as decorum among your own members, I mean, I see stuff on social media, them criticizing each other. Do you wish there was less of that?
I absolutely wish there was less of that. I will tell you that I don't know that sadly, I don't know that there's as much of that as there is around the country. When I've met with other speakers and presidents and gatherings, they do these national things where other speakers, you all get together and talk about common problems, Democrats and Republicans, and not surprisingly, the problems are similar with people that are lashing out against each other. And I'll go back to social media. I think social media, when you talk about adults, has made the culture much coarser, has made incivility, if it draws more reactions online, more of those dopamine hits of likes and hearts and angry, emojis and all that stuff. I think it's made us a coarser, less civil society altogether. And I do believe firmly that we should always conduct ourselves with civility. I will say that, I complimented the members, I think, look, I mean, people get hot occasionally, but overall, I think that people have been really civil. I think we've had, over the time I've been here, some really heated debates on important issues where there's a lot of division, and by and large, it's been civil. Nobody's, cracked a cane over somebody's neck like they've done in Congress, over the years. I mean, there's been some pretty rough stuff in history, back during previous times. And a lot of stuff that happens in Congress is just unacceptable, on the House floor, on the Senate floor. And so we have to always, and I think if you've got the stronger argument, you should be able to state it civilly. And if you can't, you're probably not articulating well, or maybe you have the losing argument. Screaming louder or screaming in an ugly way doesn't win the argument. So.
Thanks all. Thank you.